Well, it's a Friday afternoon here on Merritt Island, and for those of you who love oysters, getting out into Brevard this weekend and going to some of those fantastic restaurants that we have all across the Space Coast, you might enjoy some delicious oysters tonight or Saturday or Sunday. And when you do that, it's very possible that your oyster shells will be recycled and purposed out in the Indian River Lagoon to help clean the lagoon with this very special young lady who is with us today. This is Olivia Escandell from the Brevard Zoo. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you here. And we're going to learn about a really amazing story about how these shells, millions of pounds of these shells, are harvested by the zoo and with the help of a bunch of volunteers go out and clean the lagoon. Olivia, tell us about yourself and what your job is.
So I am the Conservation Restoration Coordinator at the Brevard Zoo in our Conservation Department. So I'm from Satellite Beach, Florida. I went to high school at West Shore Junior Senior
All right,
High.
Go West Shore.
Go
awesome.
Wildcats.
That's awesome.
And then I studied marine affairs at University of Miami. And then I came back here because I love the lagoon. I grew up on the lagoon. I grew up going to the zoo. And I really wanted to help it become a better place and a better place for wildlife and to see a cleaner lagoon. So now I work for the Restore Our Shores program at the zoo.
Wow, that gives me chills just because, you know, Brevard schools, this is what it's all about. Students growing up here, loving our community, going away to learn, getting education, and coming back and making a difference. So we're going to learn all about these babies right here. This is a bag of oyster shells. And Olivia, kind of tell us, first of all, where do we gather all these wonderful millions of pounds of shells from?
So all the oyster shells that we use in our projects come from the Shuck and Share program, which is an oyster shell recycling project. So it was started by Marine Discovery Center in Volusia County back in around 2014. And the zoo picked it up here in Brevard in 2015. And since then, we've recycled 3.7 million pounds of oyster shells.
Wait a second, let me get my almost 4 million pounds of oyster shells, bags like this. So this bag weighs about how much?
20 to 30 pounds.
Okay, so you can do the math. 20 to 30 pounds here and 4 million pounds gathered. That's amazing. Now, what restaurants do we gather them from?
So right now we have 15 participating restaurants in Brevard County, and they span all the way from Melbourne Beach up into Titusville. So our first restaurant, we have Chart House in Melbourne. We have Islands Fish Grill in Indy Atlantic. We have Sand on the Beach and Dijon's in Melbourne Beach. We also have Bunky's Raw Bar and Grill in Indy Atlantic. And then we have Bonefish Willie's over in O'Galley, River Rocks in Rockledge, and Norman's Raw Bar right here in Cocoa Village. And then right here in Merritt Island, we have Molly's Seafood Shack, and then Sunset Grill in Cocoa Beach, Jazzy's Mainly Lobster in Cocoa Beach. And then we have 2 restaurants in the port. So we have Seafood Atlantic Inc. and Fish Lips Waterfront Bar and Grill.
Thanks, Rich and Mike.
Yes, thank you. And then up in Titusville, we have Victoria's Oyster Bar and Dixie Crossroads Restaurant.
Wow, you can tell she's a West Shore student, right? She just committed all those restaurants to memory. That's awesome. So you gather up, so tell us about, you've got 15 locations, 15 restaurants. And if you're a restaurant out there that has oysters and you want to join the program, contact Olivia,
yes,
by the way.
Please.
But tell us about how often you go out and pick up the oysters, shells, and where do you go from there?
So we use a big box truck, which I had to learn how to drive, which was fun for me, but
right.
I learned a lot and it's a lot of fun. Every Tuesday we visit all the restaurants, so we kind of start down in Melbourne Beach and we go all the way up to Titusville. We collect those shells from restaurants either in 5-gallon buckets that have a sealable lid or 65-gallon rolling trash bins. So depending on the restaurant, they could have a lot of oysters or maybe not so many, but they're all important to us, every shell. Mm-hmm. After we collect them, we bring them to our shell quarantine site in Cocoa. So we drop all of those shells and then they're cleaned off by the sun and the rain so that we don't put anything into the lagoon that shouldn't be there.
How long does that take to get them cleaned by the sun and by the wind and rain?
At least 90 days. So we want all organic matter off the shell. So that could be oysters. You know, oysters that you eat here in Brevard don't come from Brevard County. They're probably harvested in Virginia or Texas, so we wouldn't want to introduce any non-native species or diseases that those oysters could be carrying.
And there's quite a permitting process you have to go through from that point, right?
There is, yes. So we construct oyster reefs within 10 feet of the shoreline at a couple different types of properties. So public lands, like a public park, county park, or private homeowners. So private properties can apply to have an oyster reef constructed on their properties.
Let me ask you that question. So of the 4 million oyster shells that you've actually put out into the lagoon, about how many, on a percentage basis, how many homeowners have participated in that versus like county lands or something like that?
So right now, the majority of our constructed reefs, so the ones that we have built, are on county properties, public lands, parks. So over half, I'd say 75%, and then 25% are on private homeowners' properties. So we have, we've built 16 reefs so far since 2016, and then we have a lot of other properties that are kind of in the queue, so to speak. So we're going through the permitting process, the site evaluation process. So over 100 property owners have applied to have oyster reefs put on their property.
Because actually, we're going to go into that in a minute, but these oysters, once they're fully functioning, they're cleaning 20 to 30 gallons of water a day each.
Exactly.
Right?
So an adult oyster can filter between 20 and 30 gallons in a single day. And oyster reefs also provide a lot of habitat for wildlife, so crabs, a couple different fish species, shrimp, and they also remove nitrogen from the water. So they're eating the algae, cleaning the water, and removing nitrogen that contributes to algae blooms.
We're here with Olivia Escandell. She's the Conservation and Restoration Coordinator for the Brevard Zoo. We love our zoo. It's an amazing place. They're doing amazing work helping to clean the lagoon up. So, so we were talking earlier about 500,000 oysters, I think, have been actually come to life on your oyster reefs, right?
Yes.
So if you do the math, folks, 500,000 oysters that the zoo and all these volunteers have created on these reefs times 20 to 30 gallons of water per day. So you're talking about these little oysters cleaning up about 10 to 15 million gallons of water every day.
Yes.
Is my math correct there?
Yes, so that's why we like
amazing.
to call them the liver of the river. So they do all the cleaning for us.
There it is. So go out and eat those oysters because it's going to be a big benefit to the lagoon. All right, so we've gathered the oyster shells. They've been cleaned for 90 days by the sun, the wind, and the rain. They get bagged up in these bags. And they get taken out to these reefs. You put them in the river, and they go to work. Now, you have to now take some hatchlings, right? Some oyster hatchlings and get them
oyster
onto
spat.
the oyster spat.
Baby oysters, yes.
Tell us how that works.
So once a year we go out and we harvest, so take from the lagoon from known oyster reefs that we know are still here and living in the lagoon. We harvest adult oysters and we take them to a hatchery down south where they reproduce the oysters, kind of make the magic happen with warm water and lots of food. And then oysters have a really special life cycle. So they're in a larval stage, which means free swimming for the first 3 weeks of their life. And we put smaller version bags of this, so about a soccer ball size oyster bag, into tanks with all those baby oyster larvae. So millions of oyster larvae swimming around in the tanks. And most will settle on these oyster shells. And those soccer ball sized bags we give to our oyster gardener volunteers. So they raise oysters off their docks for 6 to 9 months before we put them onto the reefs. So taking care of them, cleaning the habitats that they're in, the metal cages that they hang off their docks, so that the oysters get lots of fresh water and flow.
Okay, wow. Like a little hatchery.
Yes.
All over the county.
So they're little foster parents all over Brevard County. So we've had over 1,400 oyster gardeners trained in Brevard County, again, spanning the entire length of the Indian River Lagoon in Brevard.
Okay. So then you've got the hatchlings, you put them on the oyster reefs, and about how long does it take for them to grow to where they start cleaning that water?
So they're cleaning the water from the day they are kind of reproduce. So even in that larval stage, they'll filter the water a little bit. But an adult oyster, so say this size, like 3 inches, will probably take anywhere from 2 years to grow. So a year and a half, 2 years to grow to that 20 to 30 gallons a day size.
Interestingly, I didn't know this, but right now you're not allowed to take any oysters out of the lagoon, right?
Yes. So back in the 50s, and then you're probably familiar with the clam industry that was here, very large in the 70s and the 80s. But back before the clam industry, there was a large oyster fishery here. So we no longer have very many natural oyster populations, so there aren't enough to harvest, and they also close harvesting because of environmental factors. So pollution, they wouldn't want you to eat oysters that come from dirty water. So when the rains are really high and there's a lot of storm water coming into the lagoon, they'll close harvesting. But for right now, Brevard County waters, there's no oyster harvesting allowed.
Okay, do we know approximately how many years it might be before people would be allowed to take oysters out of the lagoon?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I hope that I can see it in my lifetime.
Okay.
But I'm not sure I can really give a stamp on it. But I'm hoping that, you know, when water quality improves, the natural oyster population, in addition to our reefs that we construct, can help contribute to that.
Anecdotal story on that. Laura Lee Thompson, who's a good friend of ours who owns Dixie Crossroads up in Titusville.
Yes.
She was telling me that when she was a young girl, there was actually an inlet all the way up in Titusville from the ocean into the lagoon. That she used to go up there as a little girl and go oystering and clamming. It was incredible. She said it was amazing how much it was available for oysters and so on. But then the federal government came in, they actually closed that inlet way up in the north end of the Space Center, which I was never aware of. So we want to get back to that point, don't we, when we can eventually, you know, harvest.
We do, yeah. I think that would be great. That's the history that we have here, and to see that again would be really awesome.
Yeah, but for now...
For now, we'll just restore them for their benefits to the water.
The liver in the river, let them, those 500,000 oysters, clean up the lagoon. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, you think about all this discussion about opening up inlets into the lagoon and demucking the lagoon and so on. But here we are, natural creatures, cleaning it for us.
Yes.
It's amazing, isn't it?
The natural systems that were here before, we want to restore those.
Are there any people or any organizations that you'd like to thank for making all this possible?
I'd like to thank all of our restaurants, first and foremost, because they, of course, provide all the shell. All of our volunteers we've had over the years, we've had almost 60,000 volunteers volunteer with us. So a lot of volunteers. I'd like to thank the Brevard Zoo and also the Tourist Development Council for funding the grant that funds Shuck and Share. So that's the Tourism and Lagoon Grant that funds our project.
That's awesome. Well, if you go out this weekend, as you're enjoying some of these fresh oysters in some of Brevard's best restaurants, you can be thinking about how those oyster shells are going to be helping to clean up the lagoon. And at the very end of this film, when we finish talking with Olivia, we're going to have a really nice video with Jake Zender, who's the restoration field manager at the zoo, which is going to be kind of give you some video and some more explanation about how this whole process works. Have we missed anything out, Olivia? Is there anything else we should add to this discussion?
I don't think so. I think we always want volunteers.
Okay.
And,
How do people volunteer and get involved?
So you can check our website, either the Brevard Zoo's website or restoreourshores.org. We always have our volunteer opportunities, anything upcoming. So a reef build, planting, monitoring, anything like that.
Awesome. Go out and eat those oysters, folks. Maybe a cold beer or a glass of wine or some nice water. And we're going to have a further discussion of the Lagoon Talk, which is coming up January 22nd. And if you want more information on how this lagoon is being cleaned up in all the different ways, go to Satellite High School, 5:30 p.m. on January the 22nd, and join that conversation. There's about 600 seats available in the auditorium. Go out there and meet Fred and MJ and Brandon, who are here earlier in the week talking about cleaning up the lagoon. And they'll be there to answer any further questions, sign you up as a volunteer, and maybe share some stories about these delicious oysters.
Yeah, we'll be there. So
I'm going to be eating some oysters this weekend.
Well, that's good. I hope you go to one of our restaurants.
I certainly will. Olivia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are so impressive. A West Shore student right here back in Brevard County.
Yeah.
For Olivia Escandell, I'm Giles Malone with Space Coast Daily TV.
My name is Jake Zender. I'm a restoration field manager with Brevard Zoo's Restore Our Shores program, and we're out here today at the Living Shoreline demonstration site. So we'll be looking at 3 different types of shorelines that different property owners may have, and showing them options that they can adapt to their property. These shorelines have a host of benefits to the property owner: improved water quality, shoreline protection, visual aesthetics, habitat provision, and food for native wildlife. Right now, we're on a natural shoreline that's armored on one side by riprap, a rocky shoreline, usually coquina boulders. But what you can do if you have a natural shoreline is take native vegetation that already lives along our shorelines and replant it. Things like red mangroves like we have here. Also black mangroves if you have enough elevation to get up away from kind of the tidal change. And then farther out, you can put in an oyster reef. And these are great at breaking down wave energy to slow down the waves before they get to your shoreline and start eroding your property. So mangroves in particular, in combination with oyster reefs, are great at taking out nutrients from the system. Oysters are said to filter up to 50 gallons of water a day, and mangroves are a great nutrient uptake plant. They're pulling the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water. We'll be heading down to the rocky shoreline, the riprap, to take a look at what we can do on those properties as well. We're now at the second property at the Living Shoreline demonstration site. The demonstration site is located in Indian Atlantic, Florida. Right when you get off the 192 causeway heading beachside, the property is adjacent to the causeway end, north and south. The properties included are Douglas Park, Riverside Park, both owned by the town of Indian Atlantic, and Eastminster Presbyterian Church of Indian Atlantic also donated a property for the project. What we're looking at here is riprap. It's a rocky shoreline. This is a light armoring technique where property owners will add usually coquina rocks, coquina boulders, or concrete to their shoreline to have a more hardened structure for the waves to impact. This has lots of nooks and crannies, which is better for wildlife than a seawall because it has lots of little places for them to hide, little crabs and fish and shrimp. But it's still not great. Ideally, our first example is what we would like to have all of our properties look like. A nice naturally sloped shoreline with native vegetation and an oyster reef. That being said, we can adapt living shoreline techniques to a lightly armored shoreline like this rocky revetment. So what we can do is we can add an oyster breakwater, much like we did at the first project site, either at the toe, the leading edge of the rocks, or a little farther out. And that just kind of helps slow down the waves before they even get to the shoreline. Adds to the longevity of the rocky shoreline so that you're not having to repair it after storms. It also provides more habitat, filter feeding from the oysters, better water quality. We can also pair it with native vegetation. Red mangroves are an excellent choice. They can handle being on the lower side near the water, and they can also handle being a little higher up where they'll get kind of seasonal inundation of water. And the great thing about red mangroves is those wonderful walking legs that we see, those drop roots and prop roots, will make their way into the water and help stabilize the rocks as they go. So we're at our third and final property, which is Douglas Park, owned by the town of Indian Atlantic. This park features a seawall wrapping around the majority of the property, which is the hardest armored structure that we normally see in Brevard County. Lots of properties along the Indian River Lagoon have some form of seawall or bulkhead. Douglas Park is actually an excellent test piece for living shoreline methodologies. We had Hurricane Matthew in October 2016 come through and do some pretty serious damage to the south side of the property, costing tens of thousands of dollars to repair, not even to replace the seawall, just to repair it. In the time between that hurricane and Hurricane Irma, Brevard Zoo and Brevard County were able to work with Florida Tech to do some research to look at different designs of oyster reefs in a wave tank to see what design has the best wave energy reduction. Fast forward ahead to Hurricane Irma in 2017, after these reefs were installed, and we saw no damage. These features, these living shoreline modifications that we can do to properties do have economic benefits to the property owner, in addition to improvements to the lagoon itself. There's lots of options that we have to modify different property types. Come out and see the Living Shoreline demonstration site here in Indian Atlantic.